Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and today we're going to be discussing the Landmark Thucydides. So I read the Landmark Thucydides with Stephanie Cohen and Mark over at Book Time with Elvis. Mark and I are going to be going, I think maybe twice a year, through the ancient historians. So last summer we looked at Herodotus, and this time it was the turn of Thucydides, who in a lot of ways picks up where Herodotus left off. Thucydides is talking about the Peloponnesian War, and he's writing about and at the time of the late 400s BCE. And in many ways, he's trying to be something other than Herodotus, and you certainly get that impression as you go through in that tone. Whereas Herodotus loved his asides and his detours, he had a fascination with ethnography and a good yarn. Thucydides doesn't concern himself at all with that. He wants to stick to politics and military, and that's about it. And that, of course, would influence so many historians afterwards, and history as a profession, and really only till more recently, where we start looking more historically at social history and ethnography, and we go a little bit more towards the way Herodotus was. Herodotus I found to be absolutely fun to read. Thucydides is certainly more dry. And he's not bad, though. He's certainly not a bad writer. He doesn't have any of that flavor, none of that spice that Herodotus had. He doesn't add the ethnography, the flavors, the crazy stories, the strange bestiary that Herodotus has, which in some ways can make it a little more difficult to follow what's going on, especially if you're not intimately familiar with the geography of ancient Greece, which I, of course, am not. That's why I was really thankful for the Landmark, which is constantly giving maps for where things are, almost every page, which is much needed, because we're talking about, Thucydides tries to make a case that this is like going to be the greatest war ever. It's just huge. But we're talking about a fairly small geographic area, and we're talking about all these independent city-states, which are not big. You realize, I think, in this just how small the Greek world is in many ways, but you're dealing with so many city-states that it's very easy to lose track of where you're talking about and why, because there's no distinction to them. Whereas Herodotus would give you all these crazy stories about these places and what weird maybe habits they have, at least something that will make them distinct in your mind. Here you only have a name. And all the Greek city-states really just basically seem just about the same, except every so often we get a different political structure. So I was really thankful for that. And I mentioned the political structure. That's one of I think, the cool things about Thucydides is this is not just a war, and a war, by the way, between Athens and Sparta. It is also a war of ideas. There are many instances where people are giving speeches in here, long speeches that Thucydides himself, of course, is, he fully admits that these are not word for word. He wasn't able to get all the information. He tries to be as accurate as possible, or at least to give us what they probably would have said. But really, it's each of those speeches are like lessons in political theory and debate about what kind of political structure is better than the other, and also military theory, and how do you maybe weigh the weakness of an opponent. Those sorts of things are inside the speeches all the time. So we not only have a war between city-states, we have a war of ideas going on in here as well. It's split up into 8 books. We have some background to the war, how it erupted. We have some pretty good stories actually involving Athens especially, and one of the heroes of Athens, Pericles, who Thucydides really admires, and who unfortunately dies during a plague in Athens, which is, explained or described in pretty excruciating detail in here. And Thucydides' assumption, or I shouldn't say assumption, argument, is that if only the Athenians had followed Pericles' advice by not involving themselves in more conquest and all the things they end up doing, then they would have succeeded probably in the war. We go through some other instances, other battles. Every so often, he'll kind of focus in on part of the conflict, and some of it is actually really fun, really compelling. Uh, great fun to read. Up to a point, I will say great. I'm saying great fun, but there was a point where, as I was reading this, things just started feeling a little bit almost too real, and that was because when we were as a reading group about halfway through this book, that's when Russia invaded Ukraine. And suddenly things in here started taking on different shades. When we started talking about the political alliances, you couldn't help but think of NATO. When the Athenians are basically about to invade and butcher an island, and those islanders are trying to have Athens, of course, reconsider, you couldn't help but get, kind of shades of Putin and Ukraine and what was going on there. So there was a while when I was reading this that my mind was continually going back to the things that were going on in the news, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I was eventually able to go back and just have my mind inside ancient Greece, but it added, I think, a much needed levity to this sort of reading. That we don't often have, because it's so far removed from us, it's so far removed in time and in experience, that we can often start looking at it as something of like a big, jolly old adventure. But no, this was war, and this was brutality, and, the ugliness of mankind that we see. And a lot of it, I felt like it was Thucydides kind of showing us the downfall of Athens. Athens, of course, does lose the war. It's not really a spoiler. This actually doesn't even reach the end of the war, and I'll get to that. But Athens goes from being a symbol of democracy and freedom to being something of a greedy empire that seems to lose its soul along the way. My favorite book in here, though, I think, is book 7, which was the ill-fated invasion of Athens into Syracuse over in Sicily. And Thucydides does a terrific job of putting us on the ground. There's one instance where there's a sea battle going on between the Athenian ships and the Syracusan ships, and the soldiers on shore are like swaying to the battle, and they're cheering when they think they're winning, and they're freaking out when they think they're losing. And he really puts us right there towards the end, in that book 7 especially, right down there on the ground with those soldiers. Thucydides himself does appear in this book. He was a part of the Peloponnesian War. He was in control of a certain territory that ended up being taken by the Spartans, and because of that, he was exiled for about 20 years. And it was during that time he was writing, and he was researching, and he was trying to find everything out. He tries to be as impartial as possible by even at some points considering, referring to himself in the third person, which gets a little bit awkward. Other times he says I, and puts himself right in there. But most of the time you can see he is really trying his best to be impartial and objective in this whole thing. I mean, he partly succeeds at times. Now, he died, it seems, before he was able to finish this. So the last book, book 8, has no speeches. It is unlike the other books. It feels at times a little bit more like the rough draft to maybe one of those books. It bounces around geographically very often, very quickly. The action isn't nearly as detailed. There is a really interesting instance where basically the oligarchs try to destroy the democracy in Athens, and I thought that was actually pretty interesting section. But it just sort of ends, and it ends like I think almost like 10 or 11 years. I could be wrong about that. Before the war actually ended, so he probably died before he was able to actually finish the book. So it does leave you a little bit dissatisfied to go from, especially book 7, that terrific section about the invasion of Syracuse, to book 8, which just kind of feels very hastily drawn out and then ends abruptly. It definitely doesn't have the sense of closure that Herodotus had. But I will say, I absolutely enjoyed it. I enjoyed the buddy read that I did with Stephanie and Mark. I will continue to get these Landmark editions, because it's not just the maps, but we have descriptions, in the margins about what is in each section. We have footnotes that help, and I prefer the footnotes in here rather than the endnotes. I don't want to keep having to skip around over and over again. So yeah, this was a very, very fun read, except when it wasn't, when it was, just continually reminded me of the terrible thing going on currently, even as I record this, in Ukraine. But yes, if anybody wanted to read Thucydides, I highly recommend the Landmark edition. Even though it is an old translation, actually, that they're using, it feels very modern and it is highly readable. And they've updated it wherever they needed to. So yes, once again, if you made it this far, thank you very much, as always, and thank you, BookTube.